In March of 1967, a guy arrived in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco and settled into a rundown apartment with his young girlfriend. He spent his time busking, panhandling for small change, and though he was only an average guitar player, he was a charismatic figure who, as those summer months hit their peak, gathered a commune around him and decked out an old-school bus with pillows and throws and psychedelic paint, and began espousing a spirituality that mixed traditional Christianity with Eastern religion and, of course, a whole lot of free love. His name was Charles Manson, and he'd go on to commit some of the most brutal race-related murders in recent American history. That summer of love that he joined was exactly 50 years ago, and it was a truly extraordinary moment. 100,000 people converged on a knockdown district of San Francisco to experiment with new forms of community, to experience sexual liberation and radical gender equality, to consume an awful lot of drugs and almost no soap. And yet, as Manson's story highlights, things weren't quite as glorious as he might seem. Yet to me, they did seem glorious. Born in 1972, it felt like I'd just missed something. The Beatles, the moon landings, flower power, the counterculture, everything about the late 60s seemed brighter and bolder. And so, as soon as I left school, I went on a pilgrimage out to Haight-Ashbury to see all this for myself. It was only years later, as I began to distill this fascination into a book, that I began to realize that the summer of love was really a short blast of heat in what were pretty bleak times. And it can seem that for us, now, politically, socially, and environmentally, we're in a kind of winter too, with the fight for racial equality and gender equality, with all this political tumult. It can feel as if the battle has hardened. So today, as we think about hope, I want us to look back to the 1960s, to what hope may have looked like in the counterculture, and how we might go on from here and give birth to a new countercultural movement of peace and equality. So the 1960s as a winter, really? Well, don't forget, this was the apogee of the Cold War. People were frightened about the future. Some years earlier, the orbit of Sputnik 1 had sent Washington into a flat panic, realizing that Soviet satellites armed with nuclear weapons could bring America to its knees. But initial attempts to catch up in this space race were laughable. Broadcast live, America's first rocket fired into life, lifted itself a mere mouse leap off the ground, and promptly exploded into flames, causing the media to dub it Kaputnik. And yet the specter of Soviet supremacy was no laughing matter. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis saw the world come very, very close to full-scale nuclear war. Americans felt threatened. But if there was great anxiety about this external threat, there was a sense that life was being torn apart from within, too. If the media were to be believed, wild gangs of Hell's Angels were tearing up California's highways, and this just a loud manifestation of a much deeper malaise. Life was accelerating. Consumerism was gripping. Post-World War II, traditional close-knit communities were being broken apart by waves of change and contradiction. JFK, a wildly popular president, had been assassinated, leaving the country in shock and grief. And in power now was LBJ, who pushed through great gains in welfare and healthcare and civil rights legislation, but then massively ramped up the war in Vietnam. So as 1967 dawned, it was as if America was in a kind of fog of confusion, with progress far too fast for some, but definitely far too slow for others. As temperatures rose that summer, it all came to a head. We know it now as the summer of love, but back then it was better known as the long, hot summer of '67. 159 scorching race riots burned through American cities in those short months. Because if great gains had been made in civil rights legislation, police brutality and systematic inequality were the day-to-day lived reality for too many African Americans. So here's our context, the threat of nuclear holocaust, of communism, a far-off war butchering countless sons, a president gunned down in cold blood, young men on motorcycles tearing apart communities that are already losing their soul. It's all phallic missiles and guns and thrust, masculine and violent. In dark times, where does hope come from? When societies experience stress, what do they put their hope in? The best summary I can give is that in the 1960s, hope was vertical, was about technologies of escape. With society experiencing repeated seismic shocks, people just wanted to lift away, to get high, to board escape capsules powered by whatever came to hand. So it's no surprise that right at this time, we see a huge surge in religious ecstasy. Black Pentecostalism jumping over and sweeping through white middle-class Christianity. And while these people are raising their hands to heaven, NASA is pushing for the moon. These men in shining spacesuits floating godlike above us, almost like modern-day angels. And yes, bringing a message of peace on the earth. NASA's chief rocket scientist actually gave a speech and predicted that when men manning an orbital space station view our planet against the star-studded blackness of infinity, on that day, I say, war will be banished. Well, in the late 60s, we were able, for the very first time in human history, to be able to look back and see our whole Earth as a single entity. And from this great height, it did look so peaceful. You couldn't see the bombs. You couldn't see the riots. You couldn't hear the screams of the oppressed or the smell of the napalm. From the heights of heaven, you cannot see hell. Man, if you get high enough, everything looks so beautiful. And so to the hippies, to those who gathered in San Francisco in 1967, resolved to get so ballistically high that all the hate and anguish would vanish in a vision of peace and love. Their chosen escape capsules weren't rockets or Pentecostal tongues of fire, but a few milligrams of space dust applied to the tongue, sending it tripping off into other worlds. Timothy Leary, the great guru of the hippies, had spoken at the Human Be-In of 30,000 people in Golden Gate Park in January of 1967, the event that would kickstart the much larger gatherings later that summer. Turn on, he'd said. Turn on and tune in and drop out. And here's the shocking contrast. While across impoverished American cities, oppressed people were taking to the streets and rising up and being beaten down. Right when Martin Luther King stood up and was counted and would, just a few months later, pay the ultimate price. Right at this moment, 100,000, mostly white, often well-off people got sky high and lifted away from the deep problems that their country was facing. Sure, it had all begun with great aspirations for a revolution in human consciousness. But when the college spring breakers and the draft dodgers and the disenfranchised kids and criminals like Manson arrived, activism gave way to hedonism. What was labeled hippie, one writer of the day put it, was no more than a collection of competing groups, united only by a common interest in sex and drugs. Violence soared. Disease was rife. Political hope went up in fragrant clouds of smoke. In dark times, where does hope come from? When societies experience stress, what do they put their hope in? The deeper story of the 60s is that when tensions rose, So many simply lifted away. Abandoning any ideal of working for change, they pressed escape and disappeared into ecstasy, into the heavens, into space. 50 years later, in similarly tumultuous times, we face the same temptation. A resurgent Russia, an anxious America, violence against minorities, racism, sexism, all this political tumult, the nuclear winter thawing, maybe, but in its place anyway, the specter of global warming. A whole world, it seems, in peril. And in times such as this, what will we put our hope in? Well, the choices of 50 years ago are the same with us now. Getting high is still an option. The drugs are still there if you want them, and religious ecstasy is there if you want it. And if you have the money, Elon Musk's company, SpaceX, will, from next year, fly you around the moon. But for most of us, the most potent, addictive escape capsule that we have is something slightly different. Seeing that the drugs didn't work, that reaching the moon hadn't brought peace to the earth, some of the brightest hippies of '67 went on to create a new high just down the road in Silicon Valley. Computers were where it was at now. And by the 1990s, Timothy Leary was urging a new generation of cyber hippies to turn on, boot up, and jack in. LCD is the new LSD, he might have said. And just like the drugs, the danger is that we drop out. We gaze at icons, hoping for profound visions. This high technology to which we offer almost spiritual levels of devotion. From crowded carriageways and around dinner tables, when times get tough, we open a tab of LCD and simply trip away to other worlds, more funny, less screwed up than our own. And of course, like the be-ins and the gatherings, these things are awesome and do have the power to create great change. But if we're brutally honest, most of the time, many times each day, we use them simply to lift away. Just as in 1967, if our hope is vertical, then the change we will see will be minimal. In a culture of rising nationalism, we need a new counterculture. With a mood of separation in the UK and of wall building in the US, we need this summer to be about love. But I urge you, in these tough times, when you look for what to put your hope in, do not press escape. Do not trip off into high heavens. Forgo high technology for action in rooted community. In fact, in the midst of the mayhem that was Haight-Ashbury in 1967, with hundreds homeless, hungry, sick, and lonely, the very best of the hippie ethic did show itself. Taking their name from the radical English movement, the Diggers gave away free clothing and food. Extraordinary women opened free clinics to offer health care to those who so desperately needed it. We don't hear much about it now, but this was the true summer of love. While others got high, the Diggers dug down into the hard reality of caring for a community in need. 50 years later, with the phallic once again so dominant, we need fewer rockets and more diggers. From Washington to Westminster, from Cape Canaveral to Cornwall, from Hemel Hempstead to Haight-Ashbury, now more than ever, when we are pushed down, we must rise up but not lift away. Instead, with community politics, with searing journalism, with local power initiatives and the empowerment of women worldwide, we must turn on and turn up and dig in. Refusing to get out of our heads, we must commit to working with our hands. Because the true spirit of the summer of love knows that, for hippies then as much as for hipsters now, real hope is in reaching out for one another, Real hope is horizontal. Thank you.